The salesman from the John Deere dealership in Marshalltown came out to the Peterson farm on a Tuesday afternoon in March of 1978, driving a brand new pickup truck that still had the dealer plates on it. He parked in the gravel drive next to the machine shed and stepped out wearing polished boots that had never seen a day of field work. Carl Peterson was 51 years old that spring, and he'd been farming the same quarter section in Marshall County, Iowa, since his father died in 1959. The salesman didn't waste time with small talk. He walked Carl through the numbers on a new John Deere 4440, a machine with 130 horsepower, power shift transmission, and an air-conditioned cab. The price was $42,000, but the salesman explained that Carl didn't need to think about it that way. He needed to think about the payment, which would be around $700 a month on a 7-year note at 9.5% interest. The salesman had a calculator, and he punched in the numbers right there, showing Carl how the tax depreciation would offset most of the cost in the first few years, how the increased productivity would pay for itself, how every serious farmer in the county was making the same move. He looked over at Carl's 1951 Farmall M, sitting there with 30 years of use on it, and he said that machine belonged in a museum, not in a cornfield. Carl told him he'd think about it. The salesman left his card and said he'd check back in a week, but he had a confident look that suggested he wasn't worried. He'd probably made the same pitch to a dozen farmers that month, and most of them had signed. Carl went inside and sat at the kitchen table with his wife Eleanor, and they talked about what the salesman had said. Eleanor asked if they needed a new tractor, and Carl said no, not exactly, but maybe they were falling behind. The Farmall still ran fine. Carl had rebuilt the engine himself in 1968, and he'd replaced the clutch twice and kept up with every bearing and seal. The machine didn't have a cab, which meant Carl froze in the winter and baked in the summer, and it didn't have the horsepower to pull the bigger implements that some farmers were starting to use. But it was paid for, completely and entirely, and it would probably run for another 20 years if Carl kept taking care of it. This was 1978, and the conventional wisdom in rural America had shifted in a way that made Carl's caution look old-fashioned. For most of American history, farmers had been taught to avoid debt, to pay cash when possible, to view a mortgage or equipment loan as something you took on only in desperation and paid off as quickly as you could. But by the late 1970s, that thinking had been replaced by something different. Inflation was running at 7 or 8% annually, sometimes higher. Interest rates on farm loans were around 9 or 10%, which sounds expensive until you consider that the real cost of that debt was shrinking every year as inflation eroded the value of the dollar. A farmer who borrowed $40,000 in 1978 might be paying it back with dollars that were worth 30% less by 1985, assuming inflation continued at the same rate. Meanwhile, land values were climbing at 15 or 20% a year in some parts of Iowa. Corn prices had spiked during the grain embargo years, and even though they'd come down from the peaks, they were still strong enough to make expansion look smart. The economic logic seemed bulletproof. Borrow money at 9%, invested in assets appreciating at 15%, and let inflation do the rest. The problem with that logic, like most economic logic that seems bulletproof, was that it required a very specific set of conditions to remain true indefinitely. It required inflation to continue. It required land values to keep rising. It required commodity prices to stay strong. It required interest rates to remain stable or fall. It required no major disruptions to export markets, no changes in federal policy, no unexpected shocks to the system. In 1978, most people believed those conditions would hold. They'd held for nearly a decade, and there was no obvious reason to think they'd change. The farmers who bought new John Deeres on 7-year notes weren't being reckless by the standards of their time. They were being rational. They were listening to their accountants, their bankers, their equipment dealers, and their neighbors, all of whom were saying the same thing. Leverage is how you grow, debt is a tool, and the only way to fall behind is to stand still. Carl Peterson didn't disagree with any of that exactly. He understood the math. He could see that his neighbors were expanding, buying new equipment, renting additional ground, building new grain storage. The Johnsons, who farmed 3 miles east, had just bought a new 4640 and were planning to add another quarter section to their operation. The Andersons had traded in all their old equipment for a matched set of new John Deeres, financed through the dealer at terms that seemed almost too good to be true. Even the younger farmers, men in their 30s who were just taking over from their fathers, were leveraging up, confident that they were getting into farming at exactly the right time. But Carl had a memory that most of those younger farmers didn't have, and it made him cautious in a way he couldn't entirely explain. Carl's father had farmed through the Depression, and while he'd managed to hold on to the land, it hadn't been easy. The stories Carl grew up hearing weren't about expansion and growth. They were about survival, about making it through another year, about the absolute necessity of owning things outright because debt could destroy you when prices collapsed. His father had taught him to fix his own equipment, to save money in good years, to never assume that good times would last. By the standards of 1978, that advice seemed outdated. The Depression was almost 50 years in the past. The economy had changed. The government had safety nets and support programs that hadn't existed in the 1930s. Farming was a business now, not just a way of life, and businesses used leverage to maximize returns. Carl understood all of that, but he also understood that the future is always uncertain and that debt transforms uncertainty into risk in ways that are hard to predict. So Carl told the salesman no when he came back the following week. He said he appreciated the information, but he was going to stick with what he had. The salesman tried one more time, explaining that the 7-year note could actually be structured as a variable rate loan that might come down if interest rates fell, and that the tax advantages were real money that Carl was leaving on the table. Carl thanked him again and said no. After the salesman left, Carl went out to the machine shed and spent the rest of the afternoon rebuilding the carburetor on the Farmall. It was meditative work, the kind of thing he'd done hundreds of times, and it reminded him that there was value in knowing how things worked, in being able to fix what broke, in not depending on systems you couldn't control. Over the next 2 years, Carl watched most of his neighbors do exactly what the salesman had suggested. They bought new tractors, new combines, new planters. They financed the purchases with 7-year notes, sometimes longer. They added land, either buying it at inflated prices or renting it at rates that only made sense if corn stayed above $2.50 a bushel. The conversations at the co-op and the coffee shop were full of optimism, of talk about expansion and modernization and efficiency. Carl didn't argue with anyone. He just kept farming his quarter section with his old equipment, doing his own maintenance, avoiding debt. To the outside world, he probably looked like he was being left behind. His yields per acre weren't any higher than they'd been in 1970. His equipment was visibly old. He wasn't growing. By the metrics that mattered to most people in 1978 and 1979, he wasn't succeeding. Then 1980 arrived, and the world changed. Paul Volcker, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, decided that breaking inflation was more important than protecting any particular sector of the economy, and he pushed interest rates to levels that seemed almost impossible. The prime rate hit 21% by December of 1980. Farmers who'd taken out variable rate loans found their payments doubling or tripling. A 7-year note at 9% suddenly became a note at 18 or 19%, and the math that had seemed so favorable in 1978 turned catastrophic. At the same time, grain prices started falling. The Soviet grain embargo disrupted export markets. A strong dollar made American grain expensive for foreign buyers. Corn that had been $2.80 a bushel in 1979 dropped to $2.40 by 1981, then kept falling. Land values, which had seemed like they could only go up, started dropping too. That quarter section that someone had paid $3,000 an acre for in 1979 might be worth $2,200 by 1982, if you could find a buyer at all. Carl saw what was happening before most people wanted to admit it. The Johnsons, who'd seemed so confident in 1978, were struggling by 1981. Their debt service was eating up almost all their operating capital, and they were behind on payments. The Andersons, with their matched set of new John Deeres, were in even worse shape. They'd expanded aggressively, buying land at peak prices with variable rate loans, and now they were caught in a vice between falling income and rising payments. By 1982, both families were in serious trouble. The bank started making visits, asking for updated financial statements, talking about restructuring. Carl heard about it through the network of information that flows through small farming communities, and he felt bad for his neighbors, but he also recognized that their situation was the inevitable result of choices that had seemed smart at the time. Here's what those choices had been based on: an assumption that the recent past would continue indefinitely into the future. That's not stupidity. That's actually how most people make most decisions. We look at what's been happening, we identify the trends, and we extrapolate forward. When that method works, we call it planning. When it fails, we call it short-sightedness. But the method itself is the same. In 1978, every trend pointed toward continued inflation, rising asset values, and strong commodity prices. The farmers who leveraged up weren't ignoring evidence. They were following it. The problem was that trends change, often abruptly, and when you've structured your entire operation around a particular trend continuing, you're extremely vulnerable when it reverses. Carl's approach had been different, though he'd never quite articulated it this way. He'd assumed that he didn't know what the future would bring, and he'd structured his operation to survive a wide range of possible futures, rather than to maximize returns in one particular scenario. That meant he grew slower during good times. It meant he didn't take advantage of opportunities that required leverage. It meant he looked cautious and maybe even fearful to people who were more aggressive. But it also meant that when conditions changed, he didn't change with them. His costs were low because he had no debt service. His operation was simple enough that he could adjust to different price levels. He wasn't trapped by commitments made under different assumptions. By 1983, the farm crisis was obvious to everyone. Foreclosures were accelerating across the Midwest. Some estimates suggested that a third of farmers were in serious financial trouble, either behind on payments or technically insolvent even if the banks hadn't foreclosed yet. Auction sales became common. Equipment that had sold new for $40,000 or $50,000 was going for a quarter of that at forced sales. Land was moving at steep discounts, when it moved at all. The John Deere dealership in Marshalltown, the same one that had sent the confident salesman to Carl's place in 1978, was struggling because nobody was buying new equipment, and the used equipment they were taking in trade wasn't worth anything close to what they'd financed on it. Carl didn't gloat. He wasn't built that way. But he did start paying attention to which farms were coming up for sale and what they were selling for. In the spring of 1984, the farm directly south of his place went up for auction. It was another quarter section, good ground, well maintained. The previous owner had lost it to the bank after 3 years of trying to restructure debt that had become impossible to service. The auction was on a cold Saturday in March, and there weren't many bidders. Most farmers who might have had the capital to buy were too scared, and the ones who wanted to buy didn't have the capital. Carl stood in the back of the small crowd and watched the bidding. The land sold for $1,400 an acre, less than half of what it would have brought in 1980. Carl bid on it, and he won. He paid cash, using savings that he and Eleanor had accumulated over 25 years of careful farming. $35,000 for 160 acres of debt-free farmland. 6 months later, another neighboring farm came available. This one a foreclosure that the bank was eager to move. 80 acres, not quite as good as the first parcel, but still productive ground. It sold at private sale for $1,200 an acre. Carl bought that too, again with cash. By the end of 1985, Carl Peterson owned 400 acres of farmland in Marshall County, Iowa. All of it paid for, all of it free and clear. He was still farming with that 1951 Farmall M, though he'd also picked up a newer tractor at an estate sale, a 1965 model that he got for $3,000. His total equipment investment was probably less than $10,000. His neighbors who'd bought new John Deeres on 7-year notes in 1978 were, in many cases, no longer farming. Some had lost everything. Some had managed to negotiate settlements with their banks and were starting over with nothing. Some had left farming entirely and taken jobs in town or moved away. The contrast between Carl's situation and theirs wasn't primarily about intelligence or virtue. Carl wasn't smarter than his neighbors, and he wasn't morally superior. The difference was in their assumptions about risk and their tolerance for uncertainty. The farmers who'd leveraged up in 1978 had assumed that they understood the future well enough to make long-term commitments based on that understanding. They'd assumed that the trends they could see would continue, that the experts who were encouraging them to borrow were right, that the economic conditions favorable to their plans would persist. Those assumptions had been reasonable at the time, but they'd been wrong, and the cost of being wrong when you're highly leveraged is catastrophic. Carl's assumption had been simpler. He'd assumed he didn't know what would happen, and he'd refused to make commitments that required a particular future to materialize. That meant he missed opportunities. In a world where inflation had continued at 7 or 8% and land values had kept rising, he would have looked foolish for not leveraging up. His neighbors would have been proven right, and his caution would have cost him wealth. But that's not the world that materialized. The world that materialized was one where inflation got crushed, interest rates spiked, commodity prices collapsed, and land values crashed. In that world, Carl's caution looked like wisdom. There's a deeper pattern here that shows up in every economic crisis, in every period of rapid change and adjustment. The people who survive aren't necessarily the ones who predicted exactly what would happen. Carl didn't predict the Volcker shock or the Soviet grain embargo or the precise mechanics of the farm crisis. What he did was refuse to bet everything on any particular prediction. He maintained flexibility. He kept his costs low. He avoided commitments that would force him to continue doing things a certain way, regardless of whether it still made sense. When his neighbors were locked into debt service payments that didn't adjust to falling incomes, Carl had the freedom to cut back, to wait, to adjust his operation to the new reality. When land prices collapsed and created buying opportunities, he had capital available and no debt to service. His position wasn't the result of brilliant foresight. It was the result of systematic caution and a willingness to sacrifice growth during good times in exchange for survival during bad times. By the late 1980s, the immediate crisis had passed, though the landscape had changed permanently. Many of the farms that had been in the same families for generations were now owned by people who'd bought them at auction or by corporations that had purchased land as an investment. The social fabric of rural communities had been damaged in ways that weren't immediately obvious. Young people who might have returned to farming after college or military service looked at what had happened to their parents' generation and decided to pursue other careers. The average age of farmers started climbing. The number of farms continued declining, a trend that had been underway since the 1940s, but that accelerated through the 1980s. The equipment dealers and small-town banks and seed companies that had served those farms consolidated or closed. The rural America of 1990 was recognizably different from the rural America of 1975, and much of that difference came from the choices people made in the late 1970s based on what they thought they knew about the future. Carl Peterson retired in 1994 and turned the farm over to his son David, who'd come back from college in 1986 with a degree in agricultural economics and a clear understanding of what his father had accomplished. David had seen the crisis from the outside, had studied it in his classes, had watched friends whose families lost their farms. He understood that his father's 400 acres, completely paid for and generating steady income, represented something unusual in modern American agriculture. Most farms by the 1990s carried substantial debt. Most farmers were locked into a cycle of borrowing for spring planting, hoping for good yields and decent prices, paying down the operating loan and starting over the next year. David didn't want to farm that way. He'd learned from his father that ownership mattered more than size, that freedom from debt was worth more than expansion, that the ability to survive bad years was more valuable than maximizing returns in good years. The lessons from Carl Peterson's story extend well beyond farming, beyond Iowa, beyond the 1980s. They're about the fundamental tension between growth and resilience, between maximizing expected returns and minimizing catastrophic risk. Modern economic theory tends to favor leverage and growth. We're taught that if you're not using borrowed money to expand, you're leaving opportunity on the table. We're shown calculations that prove, mathematically, that a properly leveraged investment will outperform a conservative one over time, and under certain assumptions, those calculations are correct. But the calculations depend on assumptions about the future that we can never truly validate in advance. They assume that interest rates will remain favorable, that asset values will appreciate at predictable rates, that income will remain stable or grow, that no unexpected shocks will disrupt the system. The problem is that unexpected shocks always arrive eventually. They just don't announce themselves in advance. In 1978, there was no obvious warning that Paul Volcker would take the actions he took in 1980. There was no clear signal that grain markets would weaken or that land values would crash. The farmers who borrowed heavily weren't ignoring warning signs. There weren't any, or at least none, that were clear enough to overcome the momentum of conventional wisdom. This is the cruel aspect of leverage. It punishes you most severely for events you couldn't have reasonably predicted. If you could predict them, you wouldn't have leveraged up in the first place. Carl's approach to farming, and by extension to life, was based on the assumption that unpredictable events would occur and that the cost of being wrong when highly leveraged was too severe to risk. That's a different calculation than most people make. Most people, most of the time, optimize for the most likely future, or for the future that seems to be emerging from current trends. Carl optimized for surviving unlikely but catastrophic scenarios. That meant he lived more simply than he could have afforded to. It meant he worked harder physically than necessary because he did his own repairs rather than paying someone else. It meant he drove old trucks and lived in a house that needed updating and avoided luxuries that his income could have supported. From the outside, especially in prosperous times, it looked like he was being unnecessarily frugal, maybe even cheap. But frugality and cheapness aren't the same thing. Cheapness is about avoiding expense for its own sake. Frugality is about aligning expenses with values and long-term goals. Carl's goal was never to accumulate money for its own sake. His goal was to maintain independence, to own his land free and clear, to be able to make decisions based on what he thought was right rather than based on what his creditors required. That independence had a cost, measured in foregone consumption and slower growth, but it also had a value that became apparent when conditions changed. When his neighbors were losing their farms, Carl was buying land. When they were negotiating with banks about debt restructuring, he was farming ground he owned outright. The value of that independence, of that freedom, is hard to quantify in advance, but easy to recognize when you don't have it. There's also a question about whether Carl's approach is even possible for most people in most situations. He inherited a farm from his father, which meant he started with assets and without debt. Many young farmers in the 1970s didn't have that advantage. They had to borrow to get started, and once you're in debt, the strategies available to you narrow considerably. You have to generate enough income to service the debt, which means you can't just wait out bad markets or reduce production. You're locked in. Similarly, Carl was farming during a period when it was still possible to make a living on a quarter section with old equipment and modest expenses. By the 2000s, the economics of farming had changed to the point where that approach was much harder to execute. Scale mattered more. Technology mattered more. The margins were thinner. Whether someone could replicate Carl's strategy in a different era or a different industry is genuinely uncertain. But even if the specific tactics can't be copied directly, the underlying principle remains relevant. That principle is simple. The more committed you are to a particular version of the future, the more vulnerable you are when that future doesn't materialize. Leverage is a commitment. When you borrow money to buy assets, you're committing to a future where those assets appreciate enough or generate enough income to service the debt. You're betting that interest rates won't spike, that your income won't fall, that no unexpected expenses will arise. The more you borrow relative to your equity, the less room you have for error. A small deviation from your expected future can become catastrophic. Carl's refusal to leverage wasn't based on a prediction that the farm crisis would occur. It was based on an acknowledgement that he couldn't predict the future reliably enough to stake everything on any particular outcome. That's a kind of intellectual humility that's hard to maintain when everyone around you is confidently making bets and being rewarded for them, at least in the short term. It's hard to watch your neighbors buy new equipment and expand their operations and seem to prosper while you're working with old machinery and staying small. It requires a degree of independence, both financial and psychological, that most people struggle to achieve. The story of Carl Peterson and the farmers who bought John Deeres on 7-year notes in 1978 isn't primarily a story about good people and bad people. It's a story about different approaches to uncertainty and different tolerances for risk. The farmers who leveraged up made rational decisions based on the information available to them and the incentives they faced. They were encouraged to borrow by dealers who earned commissions, by bankers who earned interest, by tax policies that favored equipment purchases, by neighbors who were doing the same thing, and by economic trends that seemed to validate the strategy. They weren't being reckless by the standards of their time. They were being normal. Carl was the outlier, the one who resisted the conventional wisdom, who maintained practices that seemed old-fashioned, who sacrificed growth for security in ways that looked unnecessary until they suddenly became essential. What happened in the 1980s in rural Iowa wasn't unique to farming. The same pattern plays out in every industry, in every economic cycle. During good times, leverage looks smart. The people who borrow to expand are rewarded with growth and profits. The people who stay conservative look like they're missing out. Then conditions change, often in ways that weren't predicted and couldn't have been easily foreseen, and the leverage that drove growth during the expansion drives catastrophic losses during the contraction. The conservative approach that looked foolish suddenly looks wise, but by then, it's too late for the people who leveraged up to change course. They're locked in, committed to servicing debt that no longer makes economic sense, and their options narrow to bankruptcy, restructuring, or selling out at distressed prices. The questions this raises don't have comfortable answers. How much growth should we sacrifice for security? How do we balance the desire to take advantage of opportunities against the need to survive unexpected adversity? How much debt is prudent, and how do we know when we've crossed the line into recklessness? How do we maintain independence of thought when everyone around us is following the same path and being rewarded for it? And perhaps most fundamentally, how do we make decisions about an uncertain future when we know that any decision requiring a particular future to materialize is inherently risky, but refusing to make such decisions means accepting slower growth and potentially missing genuine opportunities? Carl Peterson had his answers to those questions, and they worked for him in the specific circumstances he faced. Whether they would have worked in different circumstances, or whether they would work for someone else in a different industry or era, remains genuinely uncertain, but the questions themselves are permanent. They confront every generation, in every economic cycle, in every industry. The farmers who bought new tractors on credit in 1978 answered those questions one way. Carl answered them differently. By 1985, the consequences of those different answers had become undeniable, written in the pattern of who still owned their land and who didn't, who was still farming and who had moved on to something else.